Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anthony Cox, and I'm the Deputy Director in the Environment Directorate here at the OECD. Welcome to those online and welcome to those in the room. Apparently, we have nearly 400 people registered in the webinar, so we look forward to the discussions today, both in the room and on the internet. The topic of today's Green Talk Live is to present the highlights of the Global Material Resources Outlook to 2060. Both the highlights, this one, and the full report are downloadable from the OECD website, and we'll put the address up later in the talk. Now, between 1980 and 2010, the use of global primary materials comprising biomass, fossil fuels, metallic ores and non-metallic minerals rose at about twice the rate of population growth, which is about roughly in line with GDP. Now, this rate of growth was not surprisingly fastest in the developing and emerging economies. On the other hand, the mature economies tended to partially decouple the rate of material use from economic growth. What does this mean for a world where the population is going to grow to around 10 billion people by 2060, all of whom are striving for higher living standards and which will inevitably lead to increasing pressure on the environment? Well, the materials extraction and use will clearly have an impact on the environment. It has important environmental implications, including the pollution of local water resources, ecosystem disruption from mining, the emissions of gases that contribute to climate change and air pollution, environmental degradation from waste landfilling and incineration, just to name the key ones. And of course, these environmental consequences have economic consequences and health and social consequences. They will affect human health, ecosystem services, labour productivity, capital and crop yields, for example. So the issues around this increasing materials use have attracted a lot of attention in policy circles in recent years. Many countries are very interested in promoting a transition to a more resource efficient and circular economy. Some countries have actually adopted circular economy roadmaps, such as China and the EU. Other countries have adopted resource efficiency frameworks that are similar to circular economy roadmaps in many ways. For example, Japan and the United States. So this outlook takes a look at the global projections of materials use and seeks to explain the economic drivers that are determining the decoupling between economic growth and materials use. Importantly, this outlook is taking place in the absence of new policies. Basically, what does it look like under business as usual? Now, in today's webinar, Shardul Agrawala, who is the head of the Economy and Environment Integration Division, will introduce the motivations behind the report. And then Ruben Bibas, who is an economist who has led the modelling work on this report, will present the main insights from the work, particularly focusing on the projections out to 2060. So Shardul and Ruben are going to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes. Afterwards, there'll be roughly half an hour for questions. For those of you online today, you can send your questions at any time during the talk to questions moderator in the chat section of your WebEx screen, and I will convey them to the team. So this is your chance to dig deeper into this topic. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor over to Shardul and Ruben to take it from here.
Thanks very much, Anthony, and good afternoon. Before I start with the presentation, I'd like to acknowledge other members of the OECD modeling team who would not be making the presentation today, but have been absolutely critical to the development of this outlook over the last 3 years. And these members are Martin Benkovic, Jean Chateau, Rob Delink, and Elisa Lanzi. I'd also like to acknowledge some of our external collaborators who have contributed targeted pieces which have fed into this outlook. And these include University College London, Vienna University, Fraunhofer Institute, and Leiden University. So now coming to the outline of this presentation, I'll say a few words about the motivation behind this outlook and give you a bird's eye view of the outlook in a nutshell. But then we'll come to the core of the presentation, which Ruben would be making, which is about the projections of economic drivers and the resulting material use projections, and also about the environmental consequences of these projected patterns in material use. And once he's done presenting the modeling results, I'll come back briefly to talk about some of the key conclusions, but also what might be some of the policy implications of this work. And then we'll open up to questions. So motivation. I think the first point I'd like to make is that outlooks for resource use are not new. In fact, they go back at least 50 years. But at times, physical scientists and economists have come to opposite conclusions. The most famous outlook on resources is the one which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, which is the Limits to Growth report from the Club of Rome, which in 1972 made a 100-year outlook on the consequences of exponential increase in population growth and population and resource use. And they warned of cataclysmic consequences in terms of a sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity as a result of the scarcity we would face. Now, there were some contrasting arguments, and this is one of them from an economist, and he had a book titled The Ultimate Resource. And the argument was that scarcity would lead to increase in prices, which would spur innovation, substitution, efficiency, and so on. And so we would be able to address the problem before we hit the limits as a result of scarcity. Now, I must say that in the decades since this debate, there's been a much more convergent agenda between the physical sciences and the economics profession. First, I think the debate has moved from material scarcity to planetary boundaries. We're not running out of resources in the absolute sense. What we are running out is capacity to manage the waste that we generate on land, on oceans, in the atmosphere. And in economics also, there's been a move to recognize better the externalities of material use and how to correct them. And one of the big contributions of the economics profession in the last couple of decades has been to foster the greater use of economic instruments, not just in waste management, but in promoting recycling and more life cycle approaches to resource management. On the policy side, there's been a lot of progress in terms of decoupling material use from GDP, and that's become an effective proxy to track progress and to set targets. But we still lack sufficient insight on a number of key issues. First, we need to know a lot more about the granularity of material use and what drives consumption of different materials and what might be the consequences of this consumption of different materials. Second, we need to know a lot more about the drivers of resource use, not just the manifestations of resource use. And of course, what are the implications of economic interconnectedness across sectors and across countries? And finally, what are the life cycle environmental consequences of this trend in growth in resource use? So these are some of the motivations why our environment and economy modeling team undertook this work over the last 3 years. Now, just to very quickly tell you about the outlook in a nutshell, it's a global assessment, and the results are disaggregated into 12 large economies, which include 5 of the BRICS economies and 7 OECD countries, and 13 world regions. The time horizon is 2060. It includes 50 plus economic sectors and 61 different kinds of materials. Now, in terms of the overall structure, we have We start with our in-house macroeconomic model and ENV growth, which makes projections at a country level for all of the countries of the world. And these results are used to calibrate our multi-sectoral computable general equilibrium model and linkages, which has been augmented to take into account materials extraction and recycling. And also we feed in assumptions about structural change and what it means for demand and production. The output from this augmented model is projections, more detailed economic projections of the drivers of material use, from which we get the projections of different materials. And then we have soft linking with a cradle to gate life cycle assessment, which was done by colleagues at Leiden University, who took our projections to come up with assessments of environmental impacts. So that's just a quick overview. And now I pass the floor to Ruben to discuss the modeling results in more detail.
Thank you, Shadul. Good afternoon. Thank you. Good afternoon. Yes, so let me go into the results. First, with the economic drivers of material use. So we project that the global economy is going to triple from now to 2060. To that horizon, the OECD countries still remain a significant share of global GDP, about 1/3 of global GDP in 2060, from about a bit less than half of global GDP today. And most of the growth will shift towards non-OECD country, both BRICS and other developing economies. So while the global economy is set to triple, the pace of the growth is going to slow down, and it will stabilize at around 2.5% in 2060. This growth follows growing populations, but also, especially in developing countries, but also growth in living standards. If we look at GDP per capita today, ranked by the 25 countries and regions that we represent, you'll see OECD countries on the left, non-OECD countries mostly on the right. The convergence in living standard means that most of the country have GDP per capita growing to 2060, increasing a lot for emerging and developing economies on the right. Overall, the global average is projected to reach the OECD average today for the whole world. This convergence is led by technical progress, capital accumulation, institutional improvement. And to give you two examples, because we put a lot of effort into representing the dynamics of each and every country. First, other EU countries, so the Eastern European countries that recently joined the EU, are projected, because of this integration, to grow much faster than countries with the same GDP per capita level today. In contrast, fossil fuel exporters are projected to perform under average because of the energy context. This catching up of non-OECD countries it translates into investment booms. So let me explain to you how this economic catch-up will translate into investment and then into materials use. Let's start with an OECD country, the United States, which is roughly at steady state today. GDP growth rate is fairly stable overall, which translates into an increasing, steady increase in investment. And because construction is driven by investment at more than 90%, that also translates into a very linear increase in construction output, and therefore in construction materials. Now, if we take a different case, the Chinese case, The investment boom has started a couple of decades ago and is now showing signs of slowing down a bit, but it's still in the investment phase, the boom phase, until roughly 2040, which will lead to a very significant investment boom, construction, and then construction materials at a very high level, which level off in the second part of the projections after 2040. The third case I want to show you today is Sub-Saharan Africa, which is projected to start is catching up today, which leads to a very high increase in growth rate, and therefore the nonlinear patterns in investment, construction output, and construction materials. So that's a first trend that we examine in this outlook. Secondly, we looked at structural change and how it shifts activity away from material-intensive sector. So we model about 50 sectors. If we look at the material intensity, so the tons of material used per GDP produced, per US dollars of value added produced, you can see, for instance, the construction materials is one of the most intensive, material intensive sector on the left, and decreasing with the services sectors with very low material intensity on the right. From today to 2060, this material intensity is projected to decrease following technical change and substitution away from some materials. Furthermore, the sectors with the lowest material intensities are projected to grow faster than the economic average, and to the sectors with the highest material intensity. That is particularly true for services sectors, which have very low material intensity and very high growth. This is part of a very well-established trend of servitization at multiple levels, the consumption in households, the servitization of production modes, digitalization. So a lot of trends converge together for services sectors to become more important in the economy. So we identified 3 different trends that are important for material use. The phase in the economic phase of the economy, the evolution of the technology, as well as structural change. And the main question is, what's the bottom line? What are we looking at in terms of material use? So if we start today, so in 2011, it was 79 gigatons that were used in that year. Today, it's about 90 gigatons. If materials use were to keep up with economic growth as we projected, then we would reach over 350 gigatons in 2060. However, as we have seen, there are trends that slow down this growth. The first one being structural change, especially the servitization of the economy, which drives down material use to roughly 250 gigatons. And the second one would be technological change, which also reduce this growth. Overall, the central baseline projection in this outlook projects that material use is going to reach 167 gigatons in 2060, which is roughly a doubling compared to today's levels. Behind this headline number, which is fairly impressive, there is a lot of detail, especially in the modeling and the results about different materials. And we examine, as Shadul mentioned, about 60 different materials in 4 categories: biomass, fossil fuels, metals, and non-metallic minerals. The first 2 in this chart today are sand, gravel, and crushed rocks, and limestone. Those are the 2 main components of concrete. So all the infrastructures, all the houses that you build represent about half of total material consumption today. And if you look at the projections for 2060, this material use are projected to increase quite a lot. it's the main growth in absolute tonnage. In contrast, some materials have a lower tonnage compared to these non-metallic minerals, but have a much higher growth, and those are the metals, which are used in a wide variety of applications, and those are almost triple in the projections. So these results vary, of course, by materials. They also vary by country. If we look at the OECD, material use is projected to increase also steadily, but still increase, especially for the non-metallic minerals, which are multiplied by 2.5. That's a very important increase. If we look at the bricks, the pattern is a bit different. Until 2040, you have still a quite big acceleration of materials use, but a slowdown after that, which is mainly following the slowdown in China's growth then. And the third part of the world that we could look at was the developing economies, for which start from a much lower point, but because they're in the catch-up phase, they require a lot of material to build infrastructure, equip themselves, and therefore lead to a non-linear increase between today and 2060. Because we are looking at material use, one of the main questions is what happens to material sourcing, and is there a place for recycling? Now, if we looked at mining, which is the extraction of primary materials, versus recycling, which is the procurement of secondary materials, and between now and 2030, they roughly grow at the same pace overall, and that's mainly due to the fact that most of the increase in material use is in emerging and developing economies, which still need to build up their infrastructure, their stocks of materials, and therefore need to employ primary materials. But after that, in 2060, recycling grows much faster, more than tripling, which is much higher than mining. But it remains a very small share of the total economy. What does it mean for some sectors? For instance, the metals. If we look at iron and steel, both primary and secondary iron and steel are projected to grow at roughly the same pace, and that because the demand for materials is so great that recycling is today not able to provide all of this demand without additional policies in place to boost its growth. And the same pattern occurs for non-ferrous metals. So we've been talking about materials use. Gigatons in themselves are not the main concern. What's the main concern is the environmental endpoint. And we looked at first greenhouse gas emissions. And if we start from today materials management is linked to about 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. And to 2060, that holds true, but therefore the growth of greenhouse gas emissions are roughly doubling to 2060. Let me give you 3 numbers that are very interesting in that regard. The first one is in 2060, 12% of total greenhouse gas emissions, in the absence of new policies, are associated with 7 key metals. Another 12% of total greenhouse gas emissions are associated with concrete extraction and production alone. And between now and 2060, the greenhouse gas emissions related to materials management is going to increase to about 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. So there is a very clear link between material use and the climate issue. But the greenhouse gas emissions is only one of the very wide array of environmental impacts that are linked with material extraction and processing. We looked at cradle-to-gate indicators, environmental indicators, ranging from greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, as well as toxicity for people, for water, and for ecosystems. And if you look at the picture today, there are different materials that have very high impact on the environment. In particular, concrete has a very high impact on the greenhouse gas emissions. Copper has very high impact on eutrophication and freshwater ecotoxicity. Iron has a lot of very varied impact just by the sheer size of the production. And what is very striking is that to 2060, these environmental impacts are projected to double across all of the environmental impacts and the materials. Now, to give a bit of a more positive outlook on these environmental impacts, we can look at the difference between primary and secondary materials. So in this case, I'm looking at the impact per kilogram of metal produced, and the most polluting, the materials associated with the highest impacts are copper and nickel. But if you compare those environmental impacts to the impacts for secondary materials, you can see that secondary materials have much, much lower impact, at least an order of magnitude lower. And this here is the case for circular economy, because if you manage to substitute away for primary materials to secondary materials, then there is already a very big improvement in environmental impacts. So I won't go into the detail right now, but this outlook also covers projections of materials criticality, detailed projections for steel and copper, as well as a detailed analysis on the uncertainty of our projections. And I'll hand over to Shadul for conclusions.
Thanks, Ruben. And this is the final slide. So just to summarize, there are a number of conflicting socioeconomic trends that Ruben outlined, which will drive material use. And despite the reduction in material use that would result from structural and technological change, we project global material use to roughly double between now and 2060. Now, as Ruben just mentioned, this exacerbates a whole range of environmental impacts. And as you could see from the numbers he showed you, it is on a collision course with meeting the objectives of the Paris Climate Accord. Recycling becomes more competitive over time, but it's not sufficient to shift the balance between primary and secondary material use, because with the growth in demand, primary material use is also going to continue to increase in the absence of additional policies. The core point I'd like to make is that I think the whole thrust of our analysis and presentation is to highlight that it's not just about total amount of tons of material. Every material is different. There are a whole range of impacts, and different regions and countries with different levels of economic development have different patterns of consumption of different materials. So given these stark differences, we need greater granularity within resource efficiency policies. Many of our targets are about tons of materials and in relation to the GDP. And I think the case that we are trying to make is we need to go more granular. Just to give you an analogy, if you go to your doctor and your doctor says that you consume 5 kilograms of stuff a day and cut it down by 1 kilogram, you'd ask, do I cut down my sugar or my trans fats or my lipids or whatever? So you need a much more tuned diagnosis in terms of what you need to reduce. It's just reducing material use in the aggregate is not necessarily going to be the best recommendation, because the impacts of these materials are very different. Also, greater coherence is needed between resource management and climate policies. You saw the connection between resource use and climate change, but also a wider range of other policies, including trade and innovation. This is something we didn't get to today, but there are a number of connections between these policies and resource efficiency policies. And finally, thank you for joining us. This is the cover of our report, and I hand it over to Anthony.
Thank you very much, Shadul, and thanks very much, Ruben, for a great presentation on this very detailed and comprehensive report. we have question time now. We have a number of people in the room who I'm sure have some burning questions. We also have questions flowing in online. We might just ask the room first. Who'd like to kick off with a question from the room? Doesn't seem to be huge people putting their hands up, but except there is one. Who's going here? You've got inside knowledge. Zoe, please press the button and state who you are and where you're from.
Thanks, Anthony. Zoe Lagarde from the ENV Directorate. Thanks for a great presentation. I was just curious, you explained that the recycling kicked in from 2060? 2030, yeah. I was just wondering the drivers behind that. Is it more stringent policy, need for saving costs, etc.? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. So this report is about what is going to happen in the absence of new policies. So all the results presented today are without additional policies, especially on recycling. And therefore, the whole dynamics behind the penetration of recycling, not before 2030, but after 2030 until 2060, is driven by prices. And so there are two main trends behind that. The first one is that the demand for materials is just so important that there is not enough supply for it. For secondary materials, especially in emerging and developing economies, which don't have already a build-up of materials, and they can easily extract scrap from which to recycle. And the second thing is the secondary processing sectors. The growth of those sectors is hampered by very high labor costs. And therefore, it's just a question of competitiveness in those sectors.
Thanks, Ruben. Thanks, Zoe. We have a couple of questions of clarification online. First question, and we'll do them both at once. The first question is, are the numbers you've put up there, are they cumulative or are they annual production numbers? The second one is, what is materials criticality? You can just answer those.
So all of the numbers that I've presented today are yearly use. So when I talk about 167 gigatons of material used in 2060 is really projections for the year 2060. So you have to imagine that every year you use between 100 and 167 gigatons. So it's a bit more impressive numbers if you accumulate. And the second question, sorry, criticality. So criticality is a measure of supply risk for certain materials, and those materials are deemed critical that are both at high supply risk and very important in the economy. So we did an analysis for critical materials for OECD countries to 2030. Which is already a very nice addition to the topic in the literature existing today. And we examine in detail some of those critical materials, especially rare metals. So everything is in the report. Do you want to add something?
Thanks. Shadul, perhaps you could enlarge a little on that criticality issue.
Yeah. Now, I just had one additional point to make on that. I think Ruben talked about the supply risk and the importance of the material going forward. Those are the things we can model. Obviously, as most of you know, another dimension is, which contributes to supply risk are things like political stability, where the material is being extracted, and those are obviously things we cannot project, especially talking about several decades into the future. So there's another dimension to it, which obviously is outside our capabilities, especially when we're talking many decades.
Sorry, Rob, did you want to jump in? Sure.
Yes, sorry. Rob Delling, Environment Directorate, one of the co-authors of the report, actually. I just wanted to clarify that all the numbers in the report are annual numbers, but for the environmental impact assessment, we use a life cycle approach, which means that they are the cumulative environmental consequences of the extraction and production of this annual stream of materials use. But those are aggregated and
That's a very important distinction to make. Any other questions from inside the room? Please.
Andres Fuentes from the Economics Department. In your presentations, you showed that GDP of fossil fuel exporting countries is expected in your projections to grow much less, to converge much less than other non-OECD countries, and so that one might suspect that's perhaps because you have integrated decarbonization into these scenarios. And then, of course, the next thing that comes up in one's mind: are there any other feedback loops from environmental performance back to GDP performance?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So to clarify, we didn't include any decarbonization past anything that's already in place today. So that correspond to the current policy scenario of the World Energy Outlook, on which we calibrate the energy dynamics. And therefore, the economic performance for those countries is mostly linked to the evolution of the energy market as projected in this scenario, mostly with low prices for energy, and that's what drives this growth. Yeah, so, and as far as other feedback such as climate impacts on the economy, they're for the moment not included in this baseline scenario.
Thanks, Ruben. We've got another question from online, and it's one of the first ones that came in, and it's asked, what are the expectations with regard to circular economy and circular business models in the projections? How have you taken that into account? Or is that perhaps the next step? It's an opportunity to tell us where you're headed to, perhaps.
Right. That is the next step, because this particular modeling analysis is not looking at new policies, and so these are just projections under business as usual. Although we do take into account technological change that might occur and structural change and what it might mean for material use. But as a follow-up to this work, we will now be looking at policy packages to advance resource efficiency and circular economy, and then we'll be looking at what would be the benefits of policy action in terms of reduced material use as a result of those policies. So that's going to be the next phase of our work that we'll be looking at. Now, that's in relation to the modeling work that we have planned. I must say that we already have a lot of more policy analytic work which is underway. And in fact, we'll be coming out very shortly with a book which is looking at new business models for a circular economy. And here we'll not just be looking at different kinds of circular business models, but we'll be asking two important questions. What is the potential to scale up these business models beyond niche examples? And what might be the aggregate environmental consequences of the scale up? So I would just say stay tuned. This is the next book we have on the runway, and it's going to be out in about a month's time.
Always nice to have an advanced notice of the next books. A question that's really in the news these days, an issue that's in the news is plastics. We had a question online. How do you take plastics into account in this analysis?
So we do take plastic into account, but we do that indirectly. So plastics is already a transformed material, and this report is really looking at the extraction of primary material. So it will be taken into account and accounted for as mostly fossil fuels or as a very small share for plastics as biomass. So it's taken into account through those different streams, and then it's transformed by the refining industry and used in a wide array of demand sectors, and all those sectors are explicitly modeled. Do you want to touch upon the plastics one?
Just a couple of additions. Well, we haven't explicitly modeled plastics here. There are projections by some other groups, which I think one of the projections is that there would be a 5-fold increase in plastic waste between now and 2050. So that's been done by other researchers. We have an active program for work on plastics. We have been working on how to improve markets for recycled plastics, and the goal is to use the expansion of recycled plastics to reduce plastic waste and ultimately impacts like pollution in the oceans and so on. So this is one area we are looking at. We also have new work which is looking at the problem of microplastics, and finally looking at the interface between waste management and resource efficiency policies in the context of sustainable plastics design. So those are some of the areas we're working on in plastics.
Any other questions from the room? People, I'm just going to, because we've got a long list of questions online, which I will take a couple of now. One is, you put up numbers about gigatons. Can you put up numbers about value? What's the value of materials resources in 2060? What's going to... Is this really putting you on the spot?
The materials use projections in gigaton that we presented today and explained are underneath modeled as driven by economic mechanisms. And behind these economic mechanisms, you have the evolution of the economy, but different sectors and production, extraction, production, processing of materials. And therefore, yes, behind each and every of the material flows in gigatons for each material for each country, there is a corresponding economic flow that we explicitly represent and link to this material use. Some of which is explained in the book. If I had to explain all the different materials, it would take 1,000 pages for each number, but feel free to come back to us with more detailed questions, if you'd like.
Okay. Another question is, you've talked a lot about recycling, the role of recycling. What about materials reuse? Are we able to take that into account in the work?
So this is part of the next step in this project. Currently, reuse is implicitly incorporated as it is today, but we want to see if we can go further than the current models and rates of reuse today, and that will be part of the policy package that we examine this year.
That's good. One of the things that is always challenging in heroic efforts like trying to model the world resources outlook is uncertainty. What's kind of the biggest areas of uncertainty that you came across? What's the thing that really keeps you awake at night as a modeler here?
Thanks for this excellent question. It's quite an extensive question. In the current report, we specifically examined the uncertainty stemming from economic growth and population growth, which are heavily impact the materials use projections. Some of the other areas of uncertainty include technological change, especially the change in the type of materials used for a certain demand, and those are more exploratory exercises that we don't take into account in this outlook, but hopefully we'll be able to incorporate some of it as part of the discussion on the policies and how that can trigger innovation in terms of new materials.
I think one of the areas which distinguishes this outlook from some other outlooks is that we don't just present central estimates. We've actually done a systematic analysis of uncertainties in population projections and income convergence and how that might impact total material use. But as Ruben mentioned, that there are many other areas of uncertainty which we have not looked at. The one that worries me most is digitalization. And if it's going to completely transform production systems, it's going to transform business models, and how quickly it's changing a whole range of production and consumption patterns. That's something very hard to even understand right now, let alone predict over a time frame for several decades. So that for me is the big one in terms of its net impact on material use.
Another question. There we go, please.
So hello, I'm Alexandros Dimitropoulos, also from the OECD Environment Directorate. Speaking about uncertainties, I was just wondering, there are also uncertainties regarding what we call energy and mobility transitions. So the transformation of the energy system and the transformation also of the way we move around. So those could have specific impacts on material use. For example, think about, the use of, for example, electric vehicle batteries or other types of batteries that we're going to need, and that would mean, of course, a much higher consumption, of lithium or cobalt or other materials. Also, the same, for example, I would think about solar PV panels and the materials that they are needed for those devices. So I was wondering, do you have a way to take them into account? I mean, what kind of estimates you use, or what kind of projections you use regarding those types of transitions in your analysis? And do you think that they are reliable? I mean, what's the level of uncertainty you're going to have there? Thanks.
Thank you for this very easy question to answer. There are two levels of answer. The first one is in the modeling, we represent 60 different materials. So we don't directly represent each and every material. And for instance, examples such as lithium and cobalt are among the materials that are aggregated with other materials, for the simple reason that as a sector in the economy, it's a very small sector. So being able to do properly economic projections for the sector is quite hard. The second level of answer is we do examine some of those materials that usually are or often are referred to as critical materials as part of the criticality study. We look at what would happen to the supply risks for cobalt, lithium, and quite a few others, if the demand grows according to our projections, with either, so as Shadul mentioned earlier, geopolitical risks for those materials is quite important, but quite impossible to model properly. So we do a form of scenario assumptions to say if supply would continue as today, or if supply could go towards more countries that have high geopolitical risk, but higher supply. So we try to look at that. In terms of the energy transition, that's more part of the policy package, which includes part of the energy transition, and we want to in the in the subsequent report to look at not only a policy package, but different worldviews and how that will impact material use, and especially through different technologies. So
I think the core point that you made in the question is an important one. In this presentation, we showed you the linkages between resource management and greenhouse gas emissions. But what you're talking about is there are also linkages between climate change policies and their implications on resource use. If we have particular technologies being scaled up like EVs and so on, what does it mean for resource use? And that's a very important question. And it's also, I think, in the longer list of things that we have planned, it's also one of the topics we'd like to look at in the future.
Just sticking on the issue of climate change, I have a question from online, which said, thank you very much for the very interesting insights to start with, so that's good. If you had to point to the 1, 2, 3 most critical needs for action to mitigate climate risk of the doubling of materials use, what would they be? Now, I know that anticipates the next phase of the work, but given what you've found now, the materials use, climate link, what's the key things we should be paying attention to?
I definitely think, as I highlighted in the presentation, that two different type of materials we have to look at them, and it's usually well known that metals and like concrete are a very high source of greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also a very difficult issue to tackle because those are the basis of economic development. And when looking at climate policies, it's important to keep in mind that economic development rests on those materials, both for infrastructure and for the development of emerging and developing economies. But those are also materials that emit a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So as we highlighted, concrete alone is about 12% of greenhouse gas emissions even today and in the future. And that's one of the things that we could really work on, how to improve our planning of urban planning and how to build our infrastructure so that they're not only supporting growth, but also have a lesser impact on climate change. And the same for metals. Metals are ubiquitous materials today in all our appliances, computer, phones, cars, even houses and infrastructure. And it's also the same idea. It's also the basis of development for a lot of sectors, economies, and countries, but it also needs to be taken account when we do climate change policies.
Rob, you wanted to jump in there.
I would. I'm going to assume that Ruben's answer can be summarized as there's 2 points, so I can add a third, hopefully. The point I want to make, there's important trade-offs between materials use and climate policies that we need to take into account. The first one is already mentioned, that is the materials use for low carbon technologies. There are substantially higher critical material requirements in some of the renewable energy types that we do need to take into account when we design policies that are not only low carbon, but also low materials use. And so taking the integration of those two policies together can hopefully find synergies and avoid these trade-offs. The second example is an important one is, for example, in the design phase, there's often a trade-off between energy efficiency and recyclability, where you have, if you design an airplane, for example, you have choices to make about, do I want my airplane to be able to take it apart afterwards and recycle the different bits well, or do I design it such that it uses the least fuel possible? Those types of trade-offs, again, show that we do need to step away from a silo approach and think about climate policy separately and materials policy separately, but we need to come with an integrated policy package that deals with all that.
The quest for integration and policy coherence is at the heart of a lot of the work we do at OECD. Is this just making the whole project more complicated? Trying to look for a system of everything, climate and resource use and circular economy?
Yes, Anthony, it does. It's as simple as that. This is probably also why we don't have the policy report yet. We're still working on that one. But it is important. I mean, OECD has a lot for us to build upon. We have a lot of work on aligning policies, for example, and avoiding giving the wrong signals in terms of financing fossil fuels at the same time as trying to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, etc. So there's a lot to build upon. And also the modeling tools have something that is very useful in this context. And that is we can do this type of scenario analysis where we look at what kind of structures of the economy are compatible with a low carbon economy or compatible with a materials extensive economy. And so then we can compare those and identify which sectors actually in the economy are problematic for one or the other or for both, and which ones. So the type of structural change things are something that the modeling tools are especially capable of investigating.
Okay, thank you. That's probably a good note to finish up on. We've come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank, if you could put this previous slide back up. Put the previous slide up. I'd like to thank Shardul and Ruben for their presentation today, and you can of course find the report and the highlights and all the data at the website that is on the slide now. If we now go to the next slide, quick advertisement for the next Green Talk Live, which is on a report that is about to be released called "Responding to Rising Seas: Comparing OECD countries' approaches to coastal adaptation," which is on the 6th of March at the same time as today, 1700 Central European time. So please don't hesitate to join us for that talk. So with that, I'd like to thank Ruben and Shardul and all the team who are assembled here, and thank those online and those in the room. And we'll see you at the next Green Talk Live. Thanks very much.